following is a recording of R.V. Cassill done for the American Audio Prose Library in May of 1981 at his home in Providence, Rhode Island, where he lives with his wife, Kay, also a writer, and teaches at Brown University. Iowa-born and raised, Ronald Verlin Cassill was born in 1919 in Cedar Falls. He went to school at the State University and remained on to teach there in the writer's workshop until he left in 1966 to go to Brown, disaffected by what he thinks to be a colonializing trend in the Midwest. Specifically, Cassill feels that instead of promoting a regional integrity all its own, the writer's workshop has become a colonial outpost for the New York establishment. Although Cassill primarily considers himself a novelist, and is indeed prolific in that form, having published at last count some 25 novels under his own and other names, it's for his short stories, many of which reflect his love affair with the Midwest he grew up in, that he's most highly praised. He told us that his short stories reflect Cassill the magpie, that he is always working in some degree of imitation of another writer's style or manner in these stories. Despite that, there's a distinctive flavor which his readers find to be purely his own. Cassill's stories, especially those dealing with the Midwest, confront us, as one critic says, with the individual's dilemma within the voiding forces of circumstance and the inadequate alternatives open to action. But the struggle itself is affirmed through Cassill's humane perspective on the individuals he brings so beautifully to life. Another critic has compared him to Norman Mailer, saying that his fiction is unclassifiable, as omnivorous and idiosyncratic as that writer's, a text on the inadequacy of life to live up to the expectations of the imagination. We bring this up because Cassill likes that comparison, seeing his duty as a novelist to be that of consciously working with large public issues, including politics. Hoyt's Child, for instance, was done in response to the Patty Hearst affair, and Dr. Cobb's Game was done after the Profumo scandals in England. In addition to his gifts as a teacher, critic, and writer, R.V. Cassill is also a talented watercolorist, and his home is full of testimony to those gifts. In addition to the several prizes he's received for his paintings, Cassill has received the Atlantic Firsts Award, the O. Henry Prize, and the Guggenheim Fellowship. His novels are too many to list here individually. Suffice it to say that in addition to the some 25 that we can account for, he's the author of dozens of short stories, editor of the Norton Anthology of Short Fiction, and author as well of In an Iron Time, Statements and Reiterations, a collection of essays and criticism. In there, he says that a lot of mileage is being got from the declaration that the realistic novel is dead, dying, doomed, or obsolete. The decline and demise of one ritual observance of reality, the novels say, would not by any means prove that reality had shrunk or died, only that faith in it had lost one of its noblest props. Of all the arts, fiction is the one which most broadly connects the homely, private, errant, ridiculous, and immature phases of our lives with the ripened abstractions of philosophy. The type of consciousness invested in and replenished by fiction is simply the realistic orientation of the race to being and nothingness. So perhaps whatever optimism one feels about the novel can only be expressed in the conditional. Only fiction could describe what has coerced mankind into letting it die. The following reading is of the short story, The Castration of Harry Bluethorn.
I'm going to read a story of mine called The Castration of Harry Bluethorn. This is a story from the time of President Harding. I tell it as I heard it from the older generation. Ham Snyder was harrowing the tough bottomland along the creek when the determination came on him. The harrowing was mean work. This patch of land was of marginal value, not more than 3 acres with irregular borders of willows and burdocky pasture land. The soil was good, but it had never been properly cleared. The harrow kept snagging on roots or vines the coulter had severed and buried. So Ham had to keep halting the team to clear the harrow's teeth. It was unseasonably hot for April. The willows were half-leaved out with leaves like gold-green blades, and they choked off whatever breeze might have come down the creek valley. The horses were sweated. They came as near to complaining as horses are likely to do, showing Ham certain signs of disgust that he and they were wasting their strength down here where so little profit was likely to come from it. Ham was walking beside the harrow in the choking dust it raised. From the corner of his eye, he saw the harrow lurch and tilt and begin to pull out a seine of vines from the brown-gray soil. The worst mess of the morning. Instead of clearing it, he unhitched the team and left the harrow tilted at a useless angle and crossed the bridge back toward his barn. He was going to nut Harry Bluethorn without letting another day pass. He saw Fay Ellen when he had hung up the harness and turned the team out into the barn lot. She was carrying a pail toward the hen house. She wore a denim jacket over her house dress because the news hadn't got to her that the morning was sultry. Fay Ellen was not contrary like her sister Alice, but she often didn't catch on to obvious things like heat or rain or cold until someone pointed them out to her, told her to come in out of the rain. Ham went directly to their bedroom and began to change his clothes. He put on his Sunday pants and shoes, then went down to the kitchen to shave in the wash basin on the shelf beside the range. He stropped his razor a dozen extra licks on the leather before he tested it with his thumb. He worked up a dense lather with the brush, and then, as the razor took it cleanly from the tanned pink of his cheeks, he felt a crowing confidence in the blade. In the barn, he had considered using the knife ordinarily devoted to yearling pigs, but now he decided on the razor. He wiped it clean and dry and put it in its velvet-lined box and slipped the box in his back pocket. But unbearable emotions had come over him while shaving. No doubt it was the sight of his dark, honest eyes in the poor little mirror on its nail above the basin that got to him with a visual reminder of the depth of suffering, humiliation, and shame Harry Bluethorn had laid on him and Fay Ellen. His eyes seemed to be those of him despised and rejected, and a mockery to the Soap Creek Valley community and the congregation of Bethel Church. In the grip of such emotion, he went into the parlor to ease himself with music. He put a roll in the player piano and began to pump the pedals, his arms dangling straight down beside the piano stool, and tears stinging his newly shaven cheeks. The first roll he played was a semi-classical version of a hymn that he and Fay Ellen often sang in church. He comes to the garden alone. When the perforations of the paper roll had all passed, he pressed the rewind lever and pumped swiftly. He wanted also, before he went, to play Over There. It was rousing and seemed military to him. It made him think of his younger brother Pete, who had been killed by machine gun fire in the Argonne. Fay Ellen was returning from the hen house when he went out the back door. She was frightened to see him in his Sunday suit on a weekday morning. Her first thought was that something had happened to the children, and he had been called to drive over to the schoolhouse to pick up the bodies. I didn't think till I was down there plowing. I had promised Vonnie Kramer I'd come into the bank today to sign the papers on the seed loan. Oh, she said. Had I known you was driving into town, I might have gone along. What for? I was thinking I could look for some crepe to make a costume for Allegra when they have the 8th grade graduation. But I suppose I better wait until we go into Ottumwa. Yes, he said, Ottumwa. But they might never go to Ottumwa again. Alice was even more alarmed than her sister had been to see him dressed up on a weekday, driving the Model T lickety-split into their lane, making the chickens fly squawking to get out of his way. She came running down from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Fay Ellen," she yelled before she even got to the side of the car. And her eyes asked, "What have you done to her?" Ham knew what the fear in her face meant. It simply wouldn't register for him for a few hours. He had something too important on his mind to have room for any more complications. "I need Wayne to help me today," he said. "He's down in the field with the drill. I guess you can see the dust." She shaded her eyes and looked down past the barn, where the ground dipped toward the willows along the creek. They lived just 1.25 miles from Ham's place, and he might have found Wayne quicker by walking up along the creek. "What did you need him for?" It would take some fancy lying to make a convincing story for her. If he had come in his overalls asking for help, that would have been one thing. But a man wearing his Sunday clothes is plainly bound on an errand that doesn't require a brother-in-law's muscle. So he didn't answer her at all. He left the car and walked down across the pasture to the field, where a little streamer of dust followed the rig on which Wayne was riding peaceably. His Sunday shoes were whitened with dirt after he climbed the fence into the cultivated land. Wayne's dog had followed him down from the house, and glancing back, he saw that Alice was still in the yard watching him. "I'm going after Harry Bluethorn today," he told Wayne, without any other greeting at all. Wayne wrapped the reins around the brake handle and got down from the steel seat of the corn drill. He put both hands on Ham's shoulders and held him for a minute, looking square into his eyes. Wayne was a slow and placid man, not at all excitable. He had to be that way to live with Alice, who might have stirred up all kinds of fusses with the neighbors unless he kept her calmed down. "I wouldn't do that," he said. Ham pulled the box containing his razor from his back pocket and took the top off, letting the razor slide out onto his pink palm. The sight of the razor told Wayne a lot. He took several deep breaths without seeming to exhale at all. "Well," he said, "I guess you've thought it over." "And I need someone along to help hold the son of a bitch while I do it to him, or help tie him down." Wayne shook his head mournfully, continuously. "A thing like this," he said. He pulled his handkerchief from his hip pocket and mopped his red face. "Doggone, it is sultry, for sure. If Pete was alive, I wouldn't be asking you. No, sure. If Pete could give his life for his country, a man ought to be able to take care of things here at home. I see that side of it. I want that son of a bitch to know he can't just get away scot-free with coming into a fellow's own home." "Now, that's the other part of it," Wayne said. He took one more deep breath, a little deeper than the others had been. Then he said what had to be said in the name of justice. "I reckon nothing would have happened if Fay Ellen hadn't been willing. And for that matter, I don't know for a fact that anything did happen. I'm telling you. And I guess I have to ask you how you know. For in these things, a man had better be sure." Ham began to cry. "It came to me," he said. "I put 2 and 2 together, and then about 4 more. You know Bluethorn has got a big mouth, and you've heard him as well as I have heard him around the elevator or the cream station talking bad about women. I never liked it, and I never liked him, but I kept my peace, never thinking it would be sometime about Fay Ellen. She's your sister-in-law. Harry's a veteran. I reckon he brought a lot of that back from Flanders Fields. So he talks dirty, but that's a long way from being proof positive. You want me to give you proof? You want to come home with me now? We'll just sit down in the kitchen with Fay Ellen, have a little talk about it." "Oh, now then, Ham, I'm just trying to get the straight of it. It's no use talking this way unless you got something good and solid to go on." "I guess that's reasonable," Ham said. But he could not bear what was reasonable now. He ground his teeth to keep from cursing Wayne. The spasm of control was so intense it tightened his neck muscles and drew his head back until his eyelids reddened and paled, and he knew if he opened them the sun would burn straight into his brain. Quietly he said, "Then I can do it myself." Wayne was not going to let him do that. Wayne was going to come along. "I only thought it would be better to wait for nightfall," he said. So for long, long hours they killed time, driving all over the country as if on some immense journey, as though Harry Bluethorn lived far away, to be overcome in a distant foreign place. They refilled the gas tank once in Boda, and again in late afternoon in Eddyville. They bought bologna and bread and soda pop in Thurman, and had a picnic lunch in the cemetery at Wesley Chapel. Wayne did almost all of the talking they did that day, thinking things out with a coherence that Ham was not capable of now. Wayne had explained to Alice that Ham had come to fetch him because he heard of an old Dutchman on the other side of Boda who had broken his leg and might be going to sell his farm equipment and move into Des Moines. Early birds might find a bargain. "I told her that because you give Alice reason for suspicion. Why, she might get on the phone, and her and Fay Ellen get to talking. They'd figure where we were headed and get the sheriff onto us." Wayne said nothing all day to indicate he would not help castrate Harry Bluethorn that night after dark in some appropriate place. He seemed quite willing to do it. He only wanted to be sure they had thought it all out before they went ahead. "It would be a little better if we had a gun," he said, "to call him out of his house and put a gun on him. Then we can get him in the car and take him to the country. But if I had taken the shotgun, Alice would have lost her mind. She'd have known it was serious business." He said, "Now I don't reckon there's much chance of his dying from loss of blood. I sure wouldn't want the rope. If we could just cut him and make sure he knows why, he might figure it's not a good idea to go to the sheriff and make it public. He might leave town like Arden Ferris done." Around the turn of the century, Arden Ferris had moved to Wyoming after being caught molesting the children of the church janitor. His name was a warning to growing boys about what could come from dirty thoughts. He said, "I think I know where we can borrow a shotgun. Winter before last, I borrowed Alistair Gordon's pump gun, and he knows I have only the single-shot 12-gauge. At the time he came up with this suggestion, they were parked in a grove watching the sunset over the Des Moines River. They were 25 miles from home and 17 miles from the house at the edge of Boda where they meant to capture Harry Bluethorn. They had been to this spot once before when they were boys, before the war. They had come with a group of men in spring wagons to camp out for 2 nights and spend the day hand-picking the big catfish spawning under the rocks when the water was low. Now, as the crimson sun hit the surface of the river and turned it into a mournful pink, it seemed they had come back to complete an adventure left unfinished when they were boys far from home on a fishing trip, as if their day's travel could have no destination except a return to something purer and braver than what they had known as married men. We could get Alistair's gun and some shells, and if I know Alistair, he would give us a bolt of whiskey, Wayne said. I think I could use one if we are going to cut Harry Bluethorn. I don't hold with drinking, Ham said, both hands gripping the steering wheel so hard he could feel it give. The day of driving around had been either an exhausting dream or an exhausting struggle against being waked from the dream that possessed him in the morning when he knew what had to be done. Then it had seemed to him a straightforward matter of taking his razor and going into town where Harry Bluethorn worked at the cream station, gathering milk and produce from the farms around town and sending it off to the dairy in Ottumwa. Once he got his hands on the man, he had meant simply to nut him, and that was as far as he wanted to think about it. And now, as he stared straight at the blood color of the sun on the muddy water, he realized he had been tricked. Wayne had never meant to go through with it. Realizing that, he finally understood the meaning of Alice's frightened expression when he drove into their yard way back in the morning hours. You and Alice have known about it for some time, he said to Wayne, with that patient note of betrayal that is beyond bitterness. You've talked about it. You and Alice know it is true, and I suppose she got it from Fay Ellen herself. Wayne did not try to deny it outright. He just said, I thought, let sleeping dogs lie, and it would blow over. I can't say what the women may have passed between them, and I don't know if Fay Ellen told Alice that Bluethorn had actually been at her. Just he would hang around her sometimes when he came with the truck to pick up your cream. A man like that, Ham said, and the children and all. I guess if we didn't get Bluethorn, I would have to do something about her. I have thought about that, too. Let's go to Alistair's, Wayne said. He knew there was no way he could back out now. But even so, they might not have done it if the Lord had not made it so easy for them. Everything worked out very smoothly. When Wayne went to the Bluethorns' front door to knock, Cora Bluethorn came to answer the knock, peering from lamplight out onto the porch and not recognizing him, even when he told her who he was. She said, I think you'll find Harry out in back in the shed. After supper, he said he had some work to do on the truck to get it ready for tomorrow. You go down that path behind the bushes there, and you'll see his light in the shed. Bluethorn was under the truck, lying on his back with only his legs sticking out when they walked in on him. Ham stepped deliberately on one of his ankles where his overall leg was pulled up, showing his blue and white checked socks. What the hell? He asked. And then when he writhed around and poked his angry face out, he was looking into the barrel of Alistair Gordon's pump gun. That calmed him down radically. He seemed to shrivel, as if thinking the best way to escape what was coming to him was just to shrink until he disappeared. He didn't recognize either of them when he finally got enough muscles working together to wiggle out from under the truck and stand up, or didn't recognize them specifically, but only as farmers with whom he had probably dealt from time to time. If it's money you're after, it's my hip pocket here, what I've got, but... Then Ham told him his name, and Harry said, "Oh," for then he knew why they had come on him this way. "You got anything to say for yourself?" Ham asked. Harry shook his head. Ham took the box with his razor out of his back pocket and showed it to Harry. Harry said, "Oh, Jesus, no!" and started to run for it. Wayne, standing behind him, slugged him in the side of the head with Alistair's pump gun, and then it was a cinch. "Hold his pecker off to the side," Ham said. He did his work with one neat slice. Harry Bluethorn did not die from his castration. In less than an hour, his wife went looking for him and found him sitting on an overturned pail in the backyard. He was, naturally, in a state of shock, and it turned out he had lost about as much blood as his system could afford before the whole affair took on an extra dimension. But somehow, the main feeling he had from the loss of his testicles was shame. That night, and in the weeks of his recovery, the sense of shame overpowered all the other feelings he naturally underwent. He had been fooling around with the wrong man's wife, and this was what came of it. When they got him into the house, they called the doctor, old Dr. Glosser, who came in a hurry. It appears that Dr. Glosser was not altogether sympathetic with Harry. No doubt there was more than a trace of old-fashioned bigotry in the doctor's makeup to incline him to the position that anyone castrated by an irate husband must deserve it. And it is possible he had a small-town doctor's knowledge of some of the other things Harry Bluethorn had been up to. Clarice Baker's pregnancy, to take one example. Poor Clarice may have even made it out to the doctor that it was rape, and how can you tell? Nevertheless, he said before he left the Bluethorn house that night, "I think you're going to make it all right. I'll be back in the morning to check you over again. Now then, a crime's been committed, and I ought by rights to call the sheriff this very minute. But I'm going to wait until morning unless you and Mrs. Bluethorn think I ought to report it immediately." "Wait," Harry whispered from the bed. His wife, who already seemed to be having second thoughts and taking a look into past and future, nodded a grim assent. On the next day, Harry was able to take a little nourishment. When the doctor repeated his question about reporting the matter to the authorities, again Harry said, "Wait." He had learned a lesson. A major part of the lesson Harry Bluethorn learned was that a man without his testicles does not have the same feelings and principles that the same man, still in possession, would have. The chemistry of the body affects the spirit. With his balls still sending their hot messages of pride and lust to his brain, Harry would have demanded satisfaction for the loss. The loss made him minimize the sense of loss, and his sense of justice dimmed. Or he might have made demands of the law, or maybe taken a gun after Ham Snyder and his brother-in-law. In the short and long run, he did neither. He thought his lesson over. Around town, he had taken pride in his covert, rumored reputation as a sporting man with a good score among farmers' wives. If word of his castration got out, there would be a lot of snickering. Snickering he might have endured or scorned if he still had his balls to support him. Without balls, he could hardly face this derision. In a sense, his decision was made for him. If Dr. Glosser would not report the attack, he would not say anything either. In about a year, he moved to another small town across the state to make a new start. His wife Cora stood by him. She was what was known in the time of President Harding as a good woman. Driving home after the castration, Ham and Wayne were speechless, each locked in a sense of awe and horror at what had happened. Literally, they could not believe they had done what they had done. It had happened very fast. Yet there was a certain dignity of crime that made them seem larger and more solid to themselves than they had ever guessed they could be. Like two monuments in granite being carried through the night, rumbling over the planks of little bridges and bumping in the ruts of the country roads by a ridiculously frail vehicle with a stuttering motor and a canvas top. For the first 2/3 of their drive back to their farms and their own beds, neither remorse nor fear surfaced from the dark ocean into which they had plunged. Then Ham said, "You want to come to my place and wait?" It was understood that he meant wait for the arrival of the sheriff or his deputies. "I reckon you can let me off at home. Are you going to tell Alice? You going to tell Fay Ellen?" "Yes, I'll tell her." They said no more for a while. The Ford's headlights caught a very young-looking rabbit veering off the road ahead into the weeds springing in the ditch. Wayne said, "Got your razor?" "Yes." Ham suddenly smacked the steering wheel with the flat of his hand. "Damn it, his balls. I left them on the floor of the shed." "Oh, what would you—" The question was impossible to complete, did not need completing. "It's only I shouldn't have left them lying for some dog to find. I remember sort of tossing them." Now he felt remorse. It began as a trickle of anxiety about whether a scavenging dog would eat Harry Bluethorn's testicles, and it burst into an earth-drowning deluge. Remorse for what he had done to Bluethorn, yes, but beyond that, remorse for who he was, the whole life of tedium, hard work, and sin he had spent in his nearly 40 years, for having begotten children, for having married, for having dragged Wayne into awful trouble, for having been a slacker when his brother went to the war and died over there. "See you in jail," he croaked as he let Wayne out near the gate of his dark house. Then he sped home. Fay Ellen was waiting up for him, though the children were all in bed asleep by now. It was not late. It was merely past the routine bedtime for farmers, who had to put in an honest day's work every day the sun shone. "Where have you been? What did you do?" she asked with a low, piercing dread. He walked past her into the kitchen without answering. His place was still laid at the table, and he saw she had saved his supper in the warming oven of the range. She followed him in, whining. "I talked to Alice. She said you'd been there all dressed up and got Wayne. I talked to her again. Oh, I guess it was 7 o'clock. She said no sign of you. Do you want a bite? You must be hungry." He shook his head massively. He was so tired he could have fallen right there on the linoleum and slept until the law came for him. But he took hold of her arm and peered fiercely into her eyes until her gaze wavered and she muttered sickly, "What is it?" "I want you to kneel and pray with me," he said. "For what?" "Pray," he said, and with a surge of strength forced her down on her knees. It was only after he had finished praying, their usual prayer of submission and gratitude for things unspecified, that he told her he had that day castrated her fornicator, Harry Bluethorn. "Oh my God," she said. "I knew it. Why'd you have to do that?" "I had to do something. Now, Fay Ellen, I believe you can straighten up and be a good woman. It seems like I might have to spend some time in the pen for what have we done. And I want you to promise you'll be a faithful wife and a good mother to our children." She was staring at him with horror and fear, but reluctantly she promised what he demanded. As far as anyone knows, she kept her promise. Since Ham was never brought to trial, they lived together on the farm for nearly 30 years more. They had 3 more children, one of whom became a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy. Another got into the medical school at the University of Iowa, but flunked out and became an optometrist. Was their later life good? Were they happy? Had he done the right thing? They never knew, nor does anyone who told me this part of their story.
You've been listening to R.V. Cassill, recorded for the American Audio Prose Library in May of 1981. For information about other writers in this series, write us at 915 East Broadway, Columbia, Missouri, 65201. The American Audio Prose Library is funded by grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Missouri Arts Council.